So just a quick update on this channel before we begin. Over the next few months, I'm going to be embarking on a series of videos on the arguments for and against the existence of God. More specifically, I'm going to spend the next few weeks explaining some of the most prominent arguments for God without offering my opinion on them. In the sake of full disclosure, to state my perspective up front, I think some of these arguments work, and some of them don't work. So I do think it's possible to demonstrate the existence of God with philosophy, but not everything that's been offered as a way of doing that works. But I won't be getting into that until way down the line. For the next dozen videos or so, I'm just going to be explaining what these arguments are without giving my analysis. Before we begin, I think it'll be helpful if we get down early what we mean by God. After all, a lot of things have been called by the name God. But I think in the context of philosophical arguments for the existence of God, what we commonly mean are arguments for a monotheistic God. And these are the arguments I'll be explicating. So what exactly is meant by a monotheistic God? I've thought about this, and I think the best way to understand what all understandings of monotheistic God have in common is the idea of God as infinite being. Because there's certain divine attributes that are associated with God. And I think really what they all come down to is this idea of God as infinite being. Because really all these divine attributes can be traced back to this idea of infinite being. An infinite being, after all, must have infinite power. That's included under the notion of infinite being. It must have infinite knowledge. That's also under that notion. It must have infinite goodness. It must have any real thing. It must have an infinite amount of that because it has infinite being. It also can't change because changing is losing one thing and gaining another. And an infinite being has infinite being, so it can't gain any more being. And that means it must be outside of time because time is a measure of change. And that also means it can't have parts because a thing that has parts can change. So really, all of these divine attributes are present in the notion of infinite being. So when we talk about infinite being, we're talking about something that has infinite power, infinite knowledge, infinite goodness, is outside of time, doesn't have parts, isn't material. And since all those divine attributes are usually what's meant by God when we talk about philosophical arguments for the existence of God, that's what I'm going to be using as a shorthand for God. God equals infinite being. Okay. It just so happens that this is a really good transition to the first argument for the existence of God I'm going to talk about, and that's Anselm's ontological argument. Because Anselm tries to show that by this very notion of God as infinite being, God must exist. Anselm looks at this idea of infinite and this idea of being, and he says infinite means the greatest extent possible, right? And being is the most widely distributed notion possible. So an infinite being is the greatest thing that could ever possibly exist, by definition, right? And if it's the greatest possible thing, that also means it's the thought of infinite being is the greatest possible thought, which means infinite being is the greatest possible thing and also the greatest conceivable thing. Or to use Anselm's language, it's that than which nothing greater can be thought. It's a thing that it is impossible by its very nature to think something better. You cannot think something better than infinite being, or that than which nothing greater can be thought, or God. And he takes this notion of God as the greatest conceivable thing. And he says, all right, we know that we have a notion of the greatest conceivable thing. So the greatest conceivable thing exists in at least one way, and that's in our minds. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to talk about God, or the greatest conceivable thing, like we're doing right now. But then he also says, there's another way that it could possibly exist. We just don't know if it does. We know it exists in the mind, but we don't know if it exists in reality. So Anselm says there's two possible ways, really, that the greatest conceivable thing can exist. It could exist in the mind as a concept and in reality, or only in the mind. And we know it exists in one of those two ways. It at least exists in the mind. But here's the thing. If it exists only in the mind, then what we have is a thought of the greatest conceivable thing which exists in the mind. But the thing is, we could have a different thought. We could have a thought about the greatest conceivable thing which exists in the mind and in reality. And isn't that a greater thought than the greatest conceivable thing, which exists only in the mind, wouldn't we then be having a thought about something greater than that than which nothing greater can be thought? And that's impossible. What Anselm's arguing is that the very definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be thought means that it can't just exist in the mind. Because if God only exists in the mind, then there's a greater thought than that could be had of him, which is that than which nothing greater can be thought, which exists in the mind and in reality. So I guess if we had to summarize Anselm's argument, we'd put it something like this. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. That than which nothing greater can be thought can exist in one of two ways, in the mind alone or in the mind and reality. If that than which nothing greater can be thought exists in only the mind without existing in reality, then it's not that than which nothing greater can be thought, because you could think of another way it could exist, which would be greater, which is the mind existing in the mind and in reality. Therefore, that than which nothing greater can be thought cannot only exist in the mind. Therefore, it must exist in the other possible way, which is in the mind and in reality. I will say, this has been a very controversial argument in the history of arguments about the existence of God, more so than usual. Many people who accept other arguments for the existence of God don't think this one works. But I'll have to save getting into why that is for a later video.